Religion, says the Hungarian Unitarian Catechism, religion is love toward God and love toward neighbor. That's Article 1. Now, I first became aware of the Hungarian language branch of Unitarianism back in seminary. Meadville Lombard Theological School, where I studied, had and still has a long and involved relationship with Unitarian and Universalist groups from around the globe. And there always seemed to be someone preparing to go to Transylvania to teach in the seminary at Kolozsvár, and there always seemed to be a Hungarian minister or two wandering the halls. And I learned pretty quickly that they were both like us and not like us in interesting ways. They have bishops, for example, and we obviously do not. And they preach from the Bible and talk about Jesus and the Holy Spirit, which is a rarity in this country. In fact, our church would be one of the few congregations affiliated with the UUA where worship would seem familiar to them. This theological and liturgical distinction was underscored for me in seminary when a Hungarian minister said to us, "The problem with you Americans is that you have no gospel and no good news to give." It's a little startling. And whether it was actually a problem or not, of course, it's not for the minister of the Eliot Church to say, but it was a telling difference between the two traditions as they are currently practiced. The greatest prophet of God was Jesus, the Catechism says, after listing a number of other important prophets from other traditions. Jesus, it says, taught us both the knowledge and the love of God. Another difference between these two traditions is the existence of the Catechism itself. Because regardless of whether our congregation is liberal Christian in worship and approach, like the Eliot Church is, or King's Chapel in Boston, or First Parish in Weston, or whether it's part of the majority of UU churches, we are all descended from the free traditions of the New World, where catechisms are less common. But for our Hungarian language siblings, it has been an essential part of the faith that has sustained them through hard times, the likes of which we have never had to encounter as a religious community. And so they are mentioned at length in the Catechism itself. How long was this difficult period, it asks. The difficult period lasted 300 years. 300 years. 3 centuries of oppression and suppression that, incidentally, do not include such moments in their history as the Ceausescu regime of the 20th century. Born in 1510, Francis David spent his life developing the theological and institutional underpinnings of what we now know as the Transylvanian and Hungarian Unitarian churches. He was imprisoned in 1597, where he died later that year. And that is when they start the clock on those 300 years. That is when they went underground, in a place that has known more than its share of upheaval. Sometimes in Romania, sometimes in Hungary. Transylvanian life, even when not part of a religious minority, has been far from easy. In fact, the earliest version of this catechism that we read today, the earliest version, was not allowed to mention Francis David. And in fact, it required the use of Trinitarian language to describe Unitarian concepts until the late 17th century. Still, here it is, just as the church is still here, changed and adapted, reevaluated over time to serve a community in need of definition and structure. The Catechism was and is something that they could carry with them Not just because of its physical portability, it is quite small and light, but because it could be memorized and recited. You can carry it in your mind and in your heart. You can tell it and retell it during times of unrest. You see, a catechism is more than just a test for confirmation. It is the outline of an identity, a group identity that people participate in and belong to. And this document, from a still modern tradition that we can access and encounter in 21st century ways, also gives us a glimpse into that other, older passage that we read today, that long ending of Mark. Now, of the two non-original endings to the Gospel of Mark, the first, as you probably noticed, is just a brief summation, a way to squeeze later orthodoxy into a place that had none. But while it serves that function as well, the so-called longer ending has a different feel. It has a different tone. In fact, people today believe it was probably an independent document that the early church wanted to preserve somehow, and so placed it here in the Gospels. Now, as I said earlier, it too is a catechism, a brief, memorizable piece for the purpose of self-definition and for the survival of a community. And so whoever brought us this ending chose to tell the story of Jesus and their own story in broad and bold terms. These signs will accompany those who believe, it says. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. I don't know how that's going to come out on video. While the Unitarian Catechism we read doesn't go quite that far, snake handling has never been the part of any liberal tradition. It too asserts a position in a world that was, and in many ways still is, very hostile to it. So what do we learn from these statements? What do we take away from this encounter, other than an edifying lesson from our history? Should we even think about getting a catechism ourselves? Should we at Eliot Church find some sort of definitive document, longer and more involved in our covenant, to tell the world who we are? Maybe have a rule about bringing your jacket into Sunday school? Probably not. But I do know that as liberals, we have found ourselves to be at our best when engaging and testing documents such as these. Both the Hungarian Catechism and Mark, because in so doing, we test ourselves. We sharpen our minds and embolden our hearts to go further into the big questions than we would otherwise go. Neither we nor our Transylvanian counterparts, for example, would take this ending in Mark to be objectively accurate. But at the same time, we are enriched by knowing the deeply held beliefs of our theological relatives. There is power in recognizing that there is something we miss when we choose to replace an affirmative statement of communal truth with a vague sense of unity and good feeling. A UU colleague of mine once encountered a prominent liberal theologian who told her that our tradition is weak because there is no mechanism for heresy and excommunication. That essentially there was no that there was no substance, which is roughly what the Transylvanian pastor said to my class so long ago. The people who wrote our readings today had plenty of substance to share, and did their best to make what they shared in some sense true. They took great risks, but were rewarded as well, building their faith house with strong pillars and a firm foundation. So perhaps there is something in our tradition that we are willing to stand up for. Something that may sound ridiculous or controversial. But even if there isn't, we are well served by the work of others who bring their own beliefs to light, regardless of the immediate risks and consequences to themselves.